The most famous bridge in America was built by a man who never visited the construction site. For more than 10 years, Washington Roebling directed the largest engineering project in the Western Hemisphere from the window of a Brooklyn apartment, watching through a brass telescope as 600 workers, 278 feet below, raised a structure he could not touch, could not walk upon, could barely see clearly through eyes damaged by a disease no doctor in the world yet understood. His father had designed the bridge. His father was dead before a single stone was laid. His wife would finish it. That is not a summary of a footnote in the history of American infrastructure. That is the entire story of the Brooklyn Bridge. To understand why the bridge exists at all, you have to understand what the East River was in the middle of the 19th century, a problem nobody could solve. It is not technically a river. It is a tidal strait, 1,600 feet of churning salt water connecting the upper New York Bay to Long Island Sound, swept by currents strong enough to capsize small boats and thick enough with traffic, barges, schooners, packet ships, side-wheel steamers, that crossing it was an act of daily faith. Manhattan sat on one side. Brooklyn, then the third largest city in America, sat on the other, and the only way between them was the ferry. The Fulton Ferry had operated since 1814, when Robert Fulton's steam service cut the crossing to roughly 12 minutes and turned Brooklyn into something no American city had been before, a commuter suburb. The ferry landing on the Brooklyn side was a world in miniature. Coal yards, oyster houses, an iron foundry, a marble yard, a flour mill, banks and distilleries, all clustered around the slip where the boats came in. By 1853, the Union Ferry Company of Brooklyn had consolidated control of the ferry business, swallowing up smaller operators until dozens of lines crisscrossed the river. By 1870, East River ferries were carrying 50 million passengers a year. 50 million. The boats had separate ladies' and gentlemen's cabins, and the decks reeked of horse manure and coal smoke and the salt tide rolling underneath. But the ferries froze in winter. They collided in fog, at least 49 collisions between 1841 and 1860, 3 of them fatal. They could not carry heavy freight efficiently. And on the coldest days of January, when ice locked the river solid, Brooklyn was simply cut off from the rest of the world. The nation's third largest city, stranded. A merchant in Brooklyn Heights who needed to reach his office on Wall Street could stand on the landing at the foot of Fulton Street and watch the ice and wait. The crossing was roughly 1,600 feet. It might as well have been the Atlantic. The idea of spanning the East River with a bridge had floated around since at least 1800, but no one could figure out the engineering. The river was too wide, the currents too violent, the shipping traffic too dense to permit a low crossing. Any bridge would have to rise high enough to let tall-masted vessels pass beneath. And suspension bridges, the only type with spans long enough to reach, had a reputation for catastrophic failure. The Wheeling Suspension Bridge in West Virginia had collapsed in a windstorm in 1854. Engineers knew how to hang a bridge from cables. They did not yet know how to keep one from tearing itself apart. John Augustus Roebling believed he did. Roebling was born in 1806 in Mühlhausen, Prussia. He studied engineering at the Royal Polytechnic Institute in Berlin, where one of his professors was the philosopher Hegel, and emigrated to western Pennsylvania in 1831 at 25 with plans to establish a utopian farming colony for German immigrants. The colony failed almost immediately. Roebling gave up farming and got a job as a surveyor for the state of Pennsylvania, where he observed the Portage Railroad and its system of hemp ropes hauling canal boats over mountain inclines. The ropes broke constantly. Roebling, watching them snap, had the insight that would make him wealthy and eventually kill him. The ropes should be made of wire. He developed a method for manufacturing wire rope, spinning it in place rather than twisting it in a factory, and established a wire cable operation in Trenton, New Jersey that grew into one of the most profitable industrial enterprises in the mid-Atlantic states. But Roebling was not a businessman who dabbled in engineering. He was an engineer who happened to make money. And his obsession was suspension bridges. Between the 1840s and the 1860s, he designed and built 4 of them, 2 in Pittsburgh, 1 over the Niagara Gorge at Niagara Falls, and 1 spanning the Ohio River at Cincinnati. Each was longer and more ambitious than the last. Each solved a problem his competitors said was unsolvable. The Niagara Bridge, completed in 1855, carried railroad trains across a gorge that other engineers swore could not support rail traffic on a suspension span. Roebling combined cable stays, trusses, and wire rope into a hybrid system that was heavier and more redundant than any previous design. The bridge held. His competitors went quiet. By the 1860s, Roebling had his eye on the East River. He had first imagined bridging it as early as 1852 on a bitterly cold ferry crossing when the ice was so thick the boat could barely move. He spent 12 years refining the idea, fighting the ferry companies who stood to lose their monopoly, navigating the thicket of New York and Brooklyn politics, and convincing skeptical financiers that a suspension bridge with a main span of nearly 1,600 feet, half again longer than anything ever built, would not collapse under its own weight. In 1867, the New York State Legislature approved his plan. The New York Bridge Company was incorporated. Roebling was appointed chief engineer. Here is where the politics deserve a word, because you cannot build anything in New York without money, and you cannot get money without power. And in the late 1860s, power in New York City wore a diamond stick pin and answered to the name of William McGeer Tweed. Boss Tweed ran Tammany Hall, the Democratic political machine that controlled patronage, contracts, and elections across Manhattan, with a system of graft so brazen that even his allies marveled at its scale. Tweed's operatives inflated public contracts by factors of 10 and 20. A carpenter once billed the city $360,000 for a single month's work on a building with very little woodwork. And Tweed took his cut of everything. The Brooklyn Bridge could not proceed without his approval. He got a seat on the Bridge Company board. The project's eventual cost, $15.5 million, would attract Tammany's attention the way a lit window attracts moths. Whether the bridge would have cost less without Tweed is unknowable. What is known is that Tweed was arrested in 1871 and died in jail in 1878, and the bridge kept rising. But all of that was prologue. The real story begins on a single afternoon. On June 28, 1869, John Roebling stood at the Fulton ferry slip in Brooklyn, notebook in hand, surveying the spot where the Brooklyn tower of his bridge would begin. He was 63 years old. He had spent a lifetime building toward this moment. A ferry boat came in. The fender caught the pilings. The pilings caught his right foot and crushed it against the dock. His toes were amputated on the spot at his son Washington's home at 137 Hicks Street in Brooklyn Heights. Roebling refused further conventional treatment. He insisted on hydrotherapy, a continuous pouring of water over the wound, a regimen he had championed throughout his career with the unshakable certainty of a man who had been right about wire rope and suspension bridges and assumed he was right about everything else. He was not right about this. Tetanus set in within days. On July 22, 1869, John Augustus Roebling died. He was the most celebrated bridge engineer in America, and he never saw a single stone of his greatest bridge laid. The man who replaced him was 32 years old and had already survived more than most men endure in a full life. Washington Augustus Roebling, born in 1837, had studied engineering at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute and served as a Union officer in the Civil War, where he built 2 strategically vital suspension bridges under fire, one across the Rappahannock, one at Harper's Ferry, and distinguished himself at Gettysburg, where, from a hot air balloon on a late June morning in 1863, he was among the first to spot Robert E. Lee's army moving toward the town. He helped place the first cannon on Little Round Top, a position whose defense contributed directly to the Union victory. He was breveted 3 times for gallantry and left the Army as a colonel. After the war, Washington married Emily Warren, the sister of his commanding officer, General Gouverneur K. Warren. John Roebling sent the newlyweds to Europe on their honeymoon, not as a gift, but as an assignment. Washington was to study pneumatic caissons, the enormous pressurized underwater chambers that European engineers had recently developed for sinking bridge foundations below riverbeds. The honeymoon lasted a year. Washington came home with a son, a notebook full of detailed observations, and the knowledge that would nearly kill him. The trustees of the New York Bridge Company appointed Washington chief engineer without hesitation. He was his father's son. He had been involved in every stage of the planning, and there was simply no one else who understood the design. Construction began on January 2, 1870. The first and most dangerous task was sinking the caissons. A caisson, in the simplest terms, is a giant box built upside down. The Brooklyn caisson measured 102 feet wide and 168 feet long, roughly half the area of a football field. Its roof was 15 feet of solid yellow pine timber, layered and bolted and sealed with pitch. The open bottom faced downward, resting on the riverbed. Compressed air was pumped into the chamber to keep the water out, and workers, called sandhogs, descended through airlocks to dig into the muck and rock below, shoveling the riverbed into shafts that ejected the material to the surface. As they dug deeper, the caisson sank under the increasing weight of the granite tower being built directly on top of it. The caisson weighed 7,000 tons. The tower, when finished, would add tens of thousands more. Inside, the conditions were brutal. The temperature held at around 80 degrees. The compressed air made candle flames burn with a strange blue-white intensity and distorted sound so that every pick strike rang like a bell inside a vault. The workers, half naked in the dim and uncertain light, swung picks and shoveled mud in an atmosphere that the master mechanic E.F. Farrington compared to Dante's Inferno. The air was thick with the smell of wet earth and pine tar and the sweat of men working in a sealed box beneath a river. When new workers descended for the first time, many were disoriented by the pressure. Their ears popped, their voices sounded strange to them, and the silence of the river above, held back by nothing but air, pressed on them like a physical weight. Some lasted a single shift and never returned. Those who stayed earned around $2 a day. The sandhogs eventually struck, demanding $3 for a 4-hour shift in the caissons, and were forced back to work when the New York Bridge Company threatened to fire them all. The air pressure itself was the slow-acting poison that would destroy Washington Roebling. On December 1, 1870, when the Brooklyn caisson was 43 feet deep, nearly at its final resting place, a candle ignited the timber ceiling. The fire caught in the dense pitch pine roof, hidden and unreachable, fed by the compressed air that kept the river at bay. Washington threw himself at the problem. He spent a full day and night inside the caisson, directing efforts to locate and smother the blaze. When ordinary methods failed, he made a decision that could have destroyed the entire foundation. He ordered the caisson flooded, gambling that the rising water would extinguish the fire before it burned through the roof and collapsed the structure. They waited 2.5 days. Then they pumped the water out. The fire was gone. The caisson had held. But the Manhattan caisson was worse. It had to go deeper, 78.5 feet below the surface, nearly twice the depth of the Brooklyn side, because bedrock lay farther down. At those depths, the atmospheric pressure inside the chamber was crushing, and as the sandhogs ascended to the surface, something terrible began happening to their bodies. Men who had been working all day in compressed air would step out of the airlock and collapse. Some bent double with joint pain so severe they could not stand, the symptom that gave the disease its nickname, the bends. Others suffered paralysis, slurred speech, violent vomiting, blindness. The pain was described by some as being shot, by others as having the flesh ripped from every bone. On April 22, 1872, a German laborer named John Myers became the first worker to die of caisson disease after suffering abdominal cramps and collapsing at home following his second day on the riverbed. At least 3 more would follow. Over 100 men were severely affected. The project's physician, Dr. Andrew Smith, the first doctor to use the term caisson disease in a medical context, treated 119 cases and understood almost nothing about the mechanism. Nobody did. The condition was caused by nitrogen bubbles forming in the bloodstream when workers ascended too quickly from high-pressure environments. But that explanation would not be established for decades. In 1872, the sandhogs of the Brooklyn Bridge were guinea pigs in an experiment no one had designed. Washington Roebling, determined to sustain morale, stayed in the caissons longer than any of his men. In early 1872, after a 12-hour shift in the Manhattan caisson, he rose to the surface too quickly and collapsed. He was carried home unconscious. He survived, but only barely and not intact. His eyesight was permanently damaged. He suffered partial paralysis and debilitating headaches. He could not return to the construction site. He could barely climb a flight of stairs. He was 35 years old. Here is where the telescope enters the story. Washington and Emily Roebling moved to 110 Columbia Heights, a house in Brooklyn Heights with a direct view of the bridge rising from the river. Washington sat at the window of the second-floor rear room, a brass telescope trained on the construction site below. And for the next 11 years, he directed the most complex engineering project on the continent without setting foot on it. He dictated instructions to Emily. Emily carried them to the site. On his worst days, he could not speak for more than a few minutes. On those days, he wrote. He spent 4 months early in his illness compiling elaborate instructions for finishing every aspect of the bridge, fearing he might die before the towers were completed, pushing himself until the effort damaged his eyesight further and left him too exhausted to hold a conversation. According to historian David McCullough, this was the only time in known history that a major engineering project was overseen by a chief engineer who never visited the site. That was the arrangement, and for a while, that was all anyone knew. But Emily did not merely carry messages. She had spent her honeymoon years studying suspension bridges and pneumatic caissons across Europe. She had filed every scrap of news about the bridge since its inception. And now, as Washington's condition worsened, periods when he could not speak, could not see clearly, could not sustain a conversation longer than a few minutes, Emily began doing something no woman in American engineering had ever done. She learned the mathematics of cable tensions and load-bearing calculations. She reviewed blueprints. She visited the construction site daily, not as a courier, but as a supervisor, meeting with contractors, negotiating with suppliers, inspecting the work. She stood before the bridge's board of trustees and answered questions that the chief engineer himself could not attend to answer. Iron contractors who came to the bridge office expecting to meet Washington Roebling found Emily waiting instead, and she knew the specifications as well as any of them. This was not something the 19th century was prepared for. But the 19th century had not prepared for a chief engineer who could not leave his bedroom either. The bridge rose, the towers rose, 278 feet of limestone and granite, with twin Gothic arches through which the roadway would pass, each arch 117 feet tall. They were the tallest structures in New York or Brooklyn, visible for miles, and they became the city's first modern landmarks before the bridge deck was even hung. Cable spinning began in June 1877. The 4 main cables, each 15 3/4 inches thick and composed of 5,434 individual wires, were strung from tower to tower by a device called a traveler wheel, which carried the wire back and forth across the river. The greatest length of wire laid in a single day was 88 miles. And then the wire turned out to be rotten. In the summer of 1878, Washington Roebling, still directing the project from his window, began to suspect that something was wrong with the steel wire being supplied by J. Lloyd Hague, a contractor whose reputation had concerned him from the start. Roebling had insisted on testing every ring of wire Hague delivered, rather than the standard practice of testing every 10th ring. What he discovered was systematic fraud on a scale that could have killed people. Hague's men were submitting good wire for testing, receiving approval, and then switching it for cheaper, weaker stock before it was woven into the cables. Out of 80 rings evaluated, only 5 met the required standard. Hague had pocketed an estimated $300,000 in the scheme. The discovery put Washington in an impossible position. Tearing out and replacing the compromised wire would mean catastrophic delays and cost overruns that could give the bridge's political enemies the ammunition to kill the project entirely. Tammany Hall's successor, honest John Kelly, was already threatening to cut New York's funding. The last thing the trustees wanted was a public scandal. Henry Murphy and the board, the same men who had awarded Hay the contract over Roebling's objections, decided to keep the fraud quiet. Washington Roebling engineered around the betrayal. He ordered 150 additional wires added to each of the 4 main cables as a safety margin, and he required Hay to supply them free of charge. He calculated that even with the defective wire in place, the cables retained far more than sufficient strength. His father had designed the entire structure to be 6 times stronger than it needed to be, a margin of redundancy that was, in 1878, the margin between catastrophe and survival. The bad wire remains in the cables to this day, 143 years later, and the bridge still stands. Hay eventually went to prison, not for the wire fraud, which was never publicly prosecuted, but for passing bad checks. He died in 1917, by which time he had gone from being a wealthy contractor to being caught stealing an 8-cent loaf of bread from a Harlem grocer. No monument marks his grave. By 1882, the bridge was nearing completion, and Washington Roebling was in danger of losing his job. The Brooklyn mayor proposed his removal as chief engineer, arguing that a man who could not visit the site could not direct the work. There was a logic to it that was hard to argue with. The project was over budget, years behind schedule, haunted by deaths and scandal, and its chief engineer had not been seen at the bridge in a decade. Some trustees wanted to appoint a replacement and move on. Emily Roebling launched a campaign to save her husband's position. She lobbied trustees privately. She wrote letters. She persuaded key board members to visit Washington at home and assess his mental faculties for themselves. A year earlier, in 1881, she had already demonstrated what she was capable of. When a delegation of trustees visited the construction site for a tour, it was Emily who greeted them at the deck level of the Brooklyn Tower, who walked them across a narrow timber walkway between the towers, and who explained the technical aspects of the construction with such authority that several of the men, unnerved by the height, chose to take the ferry back rather than cross the walkway again. Emily was unperturbed. She had walked that bridge 100 times. She represented Washington before the American Society of Civil Engineers, becoming the first woman ever to address that body, and her command of the project's technical details was so thorough that it stunned the engineers in the room. When the trustees voted, they kept Washington by a margin of 10-7. It was Emily's doing. She had saved the bridge by saving the man whose name was on it. The bridge neared completion. The cables were wrapped. The roadway was hung. The promenade, an elevated pedestrian walkway above the carriage road, an amenity John Roebling had insisted upon because he believed people deserved to cross a great bridge on foot at their own pace with the harbor before them, was finished. The total cost had reached $15.5 million, roughly $320 million in today's money. At least 27 workers had died. Hundreds had been injured or permanently disabled. On the evening of May 23, 1883, the night before the official opening, Emily Warren Roebling climbed into a carriage and drove across the Brooklyn Bridge. She carried a rooster in her lap, a traditional symbol of victory. She was the first person to cross the finished bridge in a vehicle. At 110 Columbia Heights, Washington Roebling watched her go through the telescope that had been his window on the project for 11 years. The formal opening on May 24, 1883, was one of the great spectacles of the Gilded Age. Schools and businesses closed across both cities. President Chester Arthur crossed on foot from the Manhattan side. Governor Grover Cleveland came from Brooklyn. The mayors of the two cities met at the center of the span and locked arms, a piece of choreography that was pure symbolism and pure prophecy, though neither man knew it yet. Military bands played. Cannon salutes echoed across the harbor. 6 warships of the North Atlantic Squadron anchored beneath the bridge, and the East River filled with chartered boats, packed ferries, sailing yachts, and skiffs, hundreds of watercraft jostling for a view. Congressman Abram Hewitt delivered the main address, 24 pages, nearly 3 hours in an era before microphones, to 4,000 seated guests who could barely hear a word. The poor acoustics did not matter much. The speech was published afterward and became Hewitt's most famous. But one thing those present heard, or later read, was Hewitt's tribute to Emily Roebling. He declared the bridge a monument to the self-sacrificing devotion of a woman. That evening, 14 tons of fireworks exploded above the harbor, illuminating the towers and cables in bursts of white and gold. Courier and Ives published commemorative prints. The newspapers called the Brooklyn Bridge the 8th wonder of the world. Within 24 hours, an estimated 250,000 people had walked across the Brooklyn Bridge. They paid a penny each. A horse and rider cost 5 cents, a horse and wagon 10, a cow 5 cents, a sheep or hog 2. And then, 6 days later, the bridge nearly destroyed the public trust it had just won. On May 30th, 1883, Memorial Day, an unprecedented crowd of perhaps 20,000 people packed the promenade. Near the Manhattan stairway, a woman tripped and fell. Another woman screamed. In the packed, narrow space, with the river 135 feet below and no way to see what was happening ahead, the scream ignited a chain reaction of panic. People believed the bridge was collapsing. They stampeded toward the exits. Those at the top of the stairs were pushed down by the mass of bodies behind them. Those at the bottom were crushed against the iron railings. A young boy named Edward Colburn, 13 years old, from South 8th Street in Brooklyn, was pulled from the crush, already dead. A woman named Maud Crawford, 33, was pressed against the railing, thrown down and trampled. Sarah Hennessy, married only 7 weeks, was killed in the same crowd. 12 people died in total. 36 more were seriously injured. Pickpockets worked through the pile of bodies. The bridge had not moved. It had not swayed. It had not made a sound. The fear was entirely in the crowd's imagination, fed by a public that understood instinctively that no structure this vast and unprecedented could be trusted. They had watched it go up for 14 years. They had seen the workers die. They knew somehow about the crushed toes and the tetanus and the bends and the fire and the wire fraud. Or if they did not know the details, they knew the feeling, the suspicion that something built by men could not possibly hold. It was, in its way, the purest test the bridge would face. Not a load test, not a wind test, a test of belief. P.T. Barnum offered his own version of proof. On May 17, 1884, nearly a year after the opening, the showman led 21 elephants, including the famous Jumbo, across the Brooklyn Bridge from one end to the other. The elephants weighed collectively several dozen tons. The bridge held without deflection. It was pure theater, and it worked. The public, which had not believed its engineers, believed its elephants. In September 1883, cable cars began shuttling between terminals at either end of the bridge. Riders paid 5 cents for the trip. In the first full year of operation, the bridge's toll revenue reached roughly $400,000, promenade, railroad, and carriageway combined. By the third year, receipts hit $680,000, and over 25 million passengers had used the bridge. The ferries, which had carried 50 million passengers a year before the bridge opened, began a slow decline. The Fulton Ferry held on until 1924 before finally shutting down, 41 years after the bridge made it redundant. The Brooklyn Bridge did something no one had fully anticipated. It made Brooklyn part of New York. Not immediately, not legally. That would take the Consolidation of 1898, when Brooklyn, Queens, Staten Island, and the Bronx were merged with Manhattan to create Greater New York City. But the bridge made consolidation inevitable. It turned a tidal strait from a barrier into a commute. It let Brooklyn's residents work in Manhattan, and Manhattan's businesses tap Brooklyn's labor force and Brooklyn's real estate. Brooklyn Heights, already a fashionable residential neighborhood, became even more desirable now that Manhattan was a short walk or cable car ride away. Land values along the Brooklyn approaches surged. New commercial streets radiated outward from the bridge terminal. The bridge was the physical argument that two cities, separated by 1,600 feet of water, were, in every economic sense, already one. There is an irony in that. Brooklyn had been an independent city with its own government, its own identity, its own political boss. Hugh McLaughlin ran Brooklyn's Democrats for decades and resisted every attempt by Tammany Hall to absorb his operation. The bridge that Brooklyn had championed and partly funded, paying 2/3 of the construction cost to New York's 1/3, was the instrument that ended Brooklyn's independence. By 1898, the third largest city in America had voted itself out of existence. Washington Roebling lived to be 89 years old. He died on July 21, 1926. Long enough to see his bridge carry automobiles, long enough to see the skyline around it transform utterly, long enough to see the Williamsburg Bridge and the Manhattan Bridge rise on either side of it like younger siblings. He never fully recovered from caisson disease. He suffered headaches and partial paralysis for the rest of his life. After the bridge opened, he and Emily moved to Trenton, New Jersey. He ran the family wire rope business. He collected rocks and minerals, over 16,000 specimens, eventually donated by his son to the Smithsonian Institution. Emily Warren Roebling died on February 28, 1903, at 59, of stomach cancer. She had gone on after the bridge to earn a law certificate from New York University, to travel to Russia for the coronation of Tsar Nicholas II, and to be presented to Queen Victoria at the English court. She had been, by any reasonable measure, the chief engineer of the Brooklyn Bridge for the last decade of its construction, though no one called her that in her lifetime. A plaque on the Brooklyn Tower of the bridge, dedicated in 1951, reads, "Back of every great work, we can find the self-sacrificing devotion of a woman." The house at 110 Columbia Heights is gone now, demolished decades ago. In the 1920s, a poet from Ohio named Hart Crane rented a room in the same building. By coincidence, the same room where Washington Roebling had sat with his telescope. Crane looked out the window at the bridge his landlord's predecessor had built and wrote his most famous work, a long poem called The Bridge, without knowing whose room he occupied. The view was the same. The cables still caught the morning light in the same way. The Gothic arches still framed the same sky. John Roebling designed the bridge to be 6 times stronger than it needed to be, because he did not trust the future to be kind. He was right about that, even if he was wrong about hydrotherapy. His over-engineering absorbed the wire fraud, absorbed the decades of streetcar vibration and automobile traffic that no one in 1869 could have predicted, absorbed 143 years of salt air and weather and the daily weight of 120,000 vehicles. The bridge was designed for a world that did not exist yet, by a man who would not live to see the world that did. Today, if you walk the promenade, the one John Roebling insisted upon, the one that lifts you above the traffic into the open air, you cross in about 25 minutes, roughly twice what the Fulton Ferry took on a good day. The towers are still limestone and granite. The cables are still steel, including the defective wire that J. Lloyd Hague substituted for the real thing in 1878. The view from the center of the span on a clear afternoon is the same harbor that Washington Roebling watched through his telescope. The Statue of Liberty to the south, the tip of Manhattan to the west, the water below dense with ferries that have returned a century later to the route the bridge was built to replace. At the Brooklyn end of the promenade, near the tower where Emily Roebling's plaque is mounted, there is now a small plaza named for her. It sits roughly where 110 Columbia Heights used to stand, at the corner of Orange Street, where the house with the telescope window looked out over the river. The view from that spot has not changed. The bridge fills the sky the way it always has, the cables rising from the anchorages in long, sweeping parabolas, the Gothic arches standing open like cathedral doors. The whole thing suspended between two cities that became one, partly because three people across two generations refused to let an impossible project die. Washington Roebling, in his old age, gave an interview in which he was asked about the hardest part of building the Brooklyn Bridge. He did not mention the caissons, or the fire, or the bends, or the wire fraud, or the 11 years at the telescope, or the vote that nearly removed him. He said the hardest part was the politics. The bridge was not built by fate or destiny or historical inevitability. It was built by a man who died for it, a man who was crippled by it, and a woman who was never given the title she earned. The wire inside the cables is still bad. The bridge is still standing. It has outlived every person who built it, every person who tried to stop it, every person who feared it would fall, and every elephant that crossed it to prove it would not. The towers catch the last light of the afternoon the way they did on the evening of May 23, 1883, when Emily Roebling drove a carriage across the empty deck with a rooster in her lap, and a man at a window on Columbia Heights watched her go and could not follow.